Chris Daw KC is a criminal barrister and author. Chris, have you got a take on this?
Yes, I have. I mean, I'm involved in many cases, not only criminal cases, but police disciplinary or police misconduct cases involving officers accused of misconduct, up to and including sexual violence, which are dealt with sometimes in those proceedings. And whether it's in criminal proceedings or in police misconduct proceedings, I think the biggest issue that I've noticed over the years, and Max Hill may agree with this, is that there's a lack of joined up intelligence and information as between different police forces and as between different agencies. So in this case, we know that Couzens was involved, I think, originally with Kent Police and obviously eventually joined the Met. And it seems to me that the fundamental issue here is one of system. In other words, you know, it is not difficult in this day and age to have a system which picks up intelligence about people who then apply to the police. And many people who are so minded and this way inclined do in fact apply sequentially to different police forces. They may fail in one and then apply to another. Well, I think it may be obvious to listeners that if someone can fail to achieve recruitment to one police force, perhaps because of concerns or doubts over their character, that information should be available to any other force to which they apply. Of course, that other force will have to look at that information and assess it to see how significant it may be or if anything's changed. But the same thing, I'm afraid, happens between police forces in the case of other forms of serious sexual violence. For example, you often have people who are accused of rape or sexual assault in, let's say, London, and then they pop up in Newcastle or somewhere else accused of the same sort of crime. And the two cases are not linked together at all. Now, of course, for obvious reasons, it's vital that where you have information in one part of the country, it has to be available to police officers and prosecutors and vetters, for that matter, all over the country, so that people can be kept safe wherever they are.
OK, thanks for that. We will come back to this later, but let's talk about this programme, The Jury Murder Trial on Channel 4. It caused a bit of a stir. We've got Ed Kelly, who's executive producer on the programme. So, kind of to save me doing it, because you can do it better, just briefly describe the premise of this brilliant programme, Ed, which I'm delighted to see doing so well and been brilliantly reviewed and so on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so the premise of the programme is really questioning whether we can trust our jury system as much as we're led to believe. And we're doing that through the prism of a really thorny, complex, real murder case, which was chosen precisely because it's a very difficult, complex case that didn't have a kind of piece of smoking gun forensic evidence attached. It's all about judgment of character and that sort of thing. So in some ways, it's the ultimate test of jury judgment. So we literally played the entire trial word for word to these two juries who had separate stairwells and ways into the court and were kept entirely separately for the 2 weeks. And out of that, we've edited it down, obviously, and are exploring really the way in which we really reach decisions. Is it 12 people on an equal playing field discussing the evidence, as we'd hope, and how consistent are they is what we'll ultimately find out.
OK, and there are differences. So Max and Chris, whether or not you've seen the programme in any depth, can I ask you, firstly, Sir Max, do you think juries work well? Could they work better? Are you surprised that two different juries in this programme anyway potentially reach two different decisions?
I mean, I have a very clear view from 35 years experience, 30 of them spent week in, week out in the Crown Court, either prosecuting or defending. And that view is that we have a very good legal system in this country, and we should be very careful about criticising the decisions made by ordinary citizens when they step up, as they have in this programme, and we should applaud the 24 citizen jurors in the programme, to play their part, to do their civic duty. As to consistency, I think although this is an interesting experiment, I would be very cautious about drawing conclusions across the whole system if, as may happen, we see inconsistent verdicts from these two juries. The fact is that the law provides for alternative outcomes. It's not the jury, it's the law that provides for one answer to to this thorny, complex case, namely murder, or another answer, namely manslaughter through loss of control. And those are examples of legal concepts which are difficult, whether you have a professional judge or a lay jury of ordinary people making the decision, because this comes from Parliament, who represent us all, and we have concepts of what is reasonable in the circumstance of the case, what was the belief of the individual you're considering, what was the intention of the person that you are looking at. Those concepts cannot be placed into an algorithm or a computer which will spit out the answer. We have to rely on human judgment. And although, of course, we all recognise as legal practitioners that there are imperfections in the jury system, and there are imperfections sometimes in the way that jurors approach their task, as much as is possible is done to try to ensure that there's a focus on the evidence. And one of the things that, concerns me, but we do see in these episodes, adherence to the rules that judges impose all the way through criminal trials. Preeminently, do not make a decision until you've heard all of the evidence. Mm-hmm. It's a little hard for me to tell as a viewer whether that warning has been given, because we're looking in at a 40-minute snapshot from 2 days of edited down evidence. We're not seeing it all.
So, Chris, to be clear, from your understanding, or just help us with our understanding, most of us haven't been sat on juries. You're not just shut in a room and allowed to just deliberate whether you think you did it or not, or so on. The judge leads you to the key points, say this is what you need to decide. This aspect of it is key legally. Is that right? You're led to a certain extent, or guided.
Yeah, to a considerable extent. As Max says, the jury are told what the law is, and they are told that they must apply the law. They're given guidance nowadays much more than they used to be. Almost sort of, they're given what's called a route to verdict in most cases. So in other words, if you find that this happened, then you move on to the next stage. And so all of that is to guide the jury, to allow the jury to use the law as the guiding sort of force, if you like, behind their decision making. The jury's role is to make findings of fact and ultimately to return the verdict. But I have to say, I think the difficulty with this sort of television program, and I think it's excellent that programs are made like this, but we have to remember a number of things. This is television and this is entertainment. It is not real life. And I think the nearest metaphor that I could probably use for this is it's the equivalent of a racing or race car simulation. The people involved are not really the people who were involved in the case. They are actors playing the roles of the barristers and actors playing the witnesses and reading out the script of what was said. But of course, what the jury in the real trial were doing was looking at the real people and assessing whether they were telling the truth or not. And that is impossible in a simulation. And the same applies to the jury. The jury were not in fact doing jury service. They're participating in a television program. And so by definition, this is, whilst it's very entertaining, I'm sure, and it's got a lot of traction and a big audience, and we're talking about it now, let's not pretend that, as Max says, that a 40-minute edited highlights of what is in effect a simulation of a dramatised version of a trial remotely represents a real trial and the real sentiments that go on within a jury room and the real decisions that juries have to make. We've had 1,000 years of history in this country of a jury system. In my view, it's the best system ever created for determining the facts of serious criminal cases. And the idea that a very entertaining and very interesting and successful experiment on television says very much about the system in real life and in the real world, I think is quite fanciful.
I mean, Dr. Lee Curley is a lecturer at the Open University, a scientist interested in cognitive bias, rationality and juror decision-making. So this is your field, Dr. Curley. Yep. What do you think we can learn from this programme?
Yeah, I thought the programme is firstly really interesting. I think it is important to take into account that it is just a programme, like a previous speaker has said. But I also think some of the results have been mirrored in real-life decision studies, juror decision-making studies that I have conducted and that other people have conducted around the world, that people come in with preconceptions, pre-trial biases that limit their ability to be rational within a juror context. Now, that has happened in studies that I have done, where I have mirrored what happened on the Channel 4 programme. I've showed a video, I've given jurors decisions, and I've been able to predict their decisions somewhat based on the biases that they have told me about beforehand through surveys and questionnaires. But Other experiments have also used real-life jurors. So, for instance, in a study in New Zealand, people were in a sexual assault case. They committed as real-life jurors, and then afterwards they were given post interviews, and those interviews very much came through that rape myths, negative beliefs about rape victims really showed through and seemed to be the rationale behind their decision making. Now, I don't think juror decision making is perfect. I think it's really good that we're critical of the system and that we research the system and there's programs like this, but I also don't think it would be good to go to judge only trials, for instance, because I think similar biases will also affect their decision making.
So, Max, to what extent judges must be aware of? Obviously, everybody brings a whole lifetime of baggage of preconceptions and biases in. Now, to what extent can judges sort of allow for that? Is that the right word?
Yeah, I think that judges are adept through long experience at giving very carefully crafted, carefully worded instructions to juries from the first moment that they're sworn in all the way through to them going through the process of making a decision. Obviously, a judge never tells a jury what to decide or what their answer is going to be. That is very much the jury territory. But if there's one rule here, it must be to anyone who's called for jury service, please listen to the judge. He or she will help you to isolate the processes you're going to go through, will warn you about listening to the evidence and only the evidence, neither being a detective nor second-guessing what you're hearing. And if you follow those instructions, as the doctors just said, we all do have prejudices and bias. It's what's called experience of life. And it's not that you put all of that to one side, but you then must apply your mind in an open way to the evidence that you hear and listen to the judge. That stood us very well in a system that I absolutely agree with Chris is the best that there is. And, you know, if we're going to go further in this conversation, what's the alternative? We can't leave this just to professional judges who then will be second-guessed for every decision they make, as inferred by what Lee's just said. So stick with the system. It isn't perfect because it's about human judgment. But judges are there to guide people as they undertake this very serious task on behalf of us all.
So Ed Kelly, the executive producer on the programme, what would you say about what you've just heard?
I'd start off by saying that the directions that our jurors had were exactly the directions that the judge gave in the real trial because they were from the transcript, and they were that the juries can discuss the case whenever they're together, and juries do spend time alone in rooms during recess, not in every single trial, but they certainly do in a lot of trials, and we were replicating that. I think the idea that one point I really want to make is that we are not an anti-jury programme, we are an anti-unnecessary secrecy programme. And the reason that we've had to go to such lengths and recreate a trial is because it's actually illegal to talk to jurors for real, and it's illegal to really see or record what happens in trials. So therefore, the only way of running this experiment is to run it in the way we've run it. And actually, when you think that, you know, the nearest academic study in the UK was the Oxford one that was done in the 1970s, before it became illegal to talk to jurors, they found inconsistencies which were sort of roughly a quarter of cases. When you think there are 8,000 jury trials roughly every month in the UK, if there are questionable verdicts for 2,000 of those, surely it's worth a kind of a proper debate and perhaps relaxing the laws around secrecy in speaking to jurors and in questioning juror decisions, so that we can have a proper debate to see if the system can be improved. And it's not like the only alternative is let's just have a judge. You know, maybe we could look at things like jury selection. So in the past in the UK, barristers on the defence and prosecution used to be able to give questionnaires to juries, and they would have the ability to remove one or two juries each to try and eliminate some of the obvious biases that might take place inside the jury room. Or our own coroner's court, juries give reasons for their verdicts. There are lots of systems out there. We're just saying, let's have a debate about it rather than maybe just dismissing it as a piece of reality telly.
Well, I suppose, Chris, you know, if there is no debate and it's kind of shrouded in secrecy, then you end up with television programmes like this sort of filling that gap, which is absolutely right. Well, what about the idea of jury selection? Some mechanism there?
Well, I mean, that in the US is very much part of the system. It was part of the system in England and Wales for many years. There were rights to challenge jurors. Nowadays, there are regularly questionnaires for jurors to establish whether they have any connection to the case, whether they know any of the witnesses, whether they're connected in any way to an organisation that may be involved. So that continues to this day. I think that in some ways this illustrates the difference between a real jury and a television jury. And that difference is that a real jury knows that its deliberations are entirely private and confidential, whereas the sort of fake jury, if you like, the television jury, knows that they're being filmed, and they know that potentially anything they say could be on television. Now, you can't really imagine, you know, I'm not a psychologist, but realistically, psychologically, there is enormous difference between deliberating in private over a real case where someone might actually go to prison for life and deliberating in front of cameras, having seen performances by actors. I mean, it's a completely different experience and a completely different process. All I would say is it's very useful to draw attention to the fact that people bring prejudices into the jury room, but that's the advantage of the jury system, is that the reason we have 12 jurors and not 1 or 2 is because the pooled wisdom and the pooled experiences, and to a degree prejudices and life experiences of 12 people, generally, on average, produces a result which broadly reflects the correct verdict. And that verdict may not be correct in the sense that every guilty person is convicted, because that's not what the system is about. The system is about whether the prosecution in any given case has proved beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. And that, of course, by definition means that a certain number of people who are guilty will be acquitted because there's not enough evidence and the jury can't be sure that they're guilty. And that's part and parcel of the system. So all I would say is, let's be very, very cautious about drawing too much from this. I don't remotely agree that we should allow jurors, as happens in the States, to speak to others. I mean, in the US, we'll have seen in many of these trials, they can give interviews after the trial to the press. I believe that completely undermines the sacrosanct privacy of the jury room, and that's one of its great strengths, and that's what television, with the best will in the world, cannot really examine.
I mean, Ed, I'm beginning to feel a bit sorry for you, because it sounds like everyone's having a pop at your programme, which they, they absolutely aren't. I mean, I just wonder, in terms of, in terms of jury selection, if you like, how did you select your juries? That is because were they cast in a television sense? I mean, to replicate the system properly, they'd have to be picked at random, wouldn't they? Which no television producer's going to take that kind of gamble.
Well, it would be impossible for us anyway, because actually, when jurors are selected in real life, they're under the pay of the law to appear and do their civic duty, and obviously we can't force people to go on a TV programme. So yes, we did do a casting through local press and social media, saying would people like to take part in this experiment. We obviously tried to be as representative as we could of the local area. We eliminated what you might term sort of obvious telly wannabes. We wanted this to really feel like it was a kind of every person cross-section of the Chelmsford and London area, or North East London area. And so I think we were sort of broadly successful with that. We've had some people who said, the backstories are just so pertinent, they must have been placed. I can tell you, we did not seek people who'd had abusive or dysfunctional relationships. These things are tragically common in our society, and you don't have to look very hard for people that have got relevant experiences. One example, Gary, his wife in episode 2 attempted to run him over. That was an example of a red mist moment. We didn't even know about that until the filming. So, the idea that we sort of somehow have placed and gamed and manipulated all this is just not true. And I guess ultimately what I'd really like to say to these people is, why not allow shadow jury experiments that, as used to take place in the 70s, why not allow academics to continue to carry those out so that we can, not via a TV program, but via a proper, large-scale academic study, look at this?
Adrian, can I just
Yes,
touch
go
on
on.
that if that's all right? Yeah, I just want to say I totally agree with Ed on two things there. Like, as an academic, I have to do mock simulations in this country, and there is some weight to that, but in the same way as the programme, those participants know they don't have any real consequences. That's always a limitation thrown at me by legal professionals. And if we did have access to shadow juries, that'd make my job a lot more easier. I'd be able to actually see what biases were affecting, whether, as the lawyer says, if through deliberations, if that decreases pre-trial biases or not. So I really agree with that. And I also agree with his point that we could have some form of jury selection in this country, maybe not run by lawyers, but again, run by psychologists looking for biases that are negative and should be filtered out of the system. So, yeah, thank you.
Can I just have a final thought from you, Sir Max?
Yeah, let me say to Ed that there's one really positive benefit to his programme, which I think we should call out, and that is that it shows just how serious the work is that's conducted in Crown courts up and down the country every week. I did one of these programmes on Channel 4 about 8 years ago, and the reason I did it was not just an interest about how juries work, but to try to demonstrate what lawyers do. And albeit in this programme they're actors, my hope is that there are young, able people who may not have thought of a career in law who now realise, actually, it's really important that we have good legal representation, to just look at how serious the decisions are that come out of Crown Court. So that's a real positive. Mm-hmm. On the question of changing the system, I'm absolutely with Chris on that. And, for what it's worth, between us, it must be about 7 decades of experience in court. I think he makes a fundamentally good point that there is an impact of a camera in someone's face, which is hard to weigh up, but it's definitely there. And the fact that these jurors know that cameras are on them makes this fundamentally.
Can I answer that really quickly?
Go on quickly.
Basically, they were filmed only on rig cameras and from behind screens. So the only time they ever saw a camera person was in the actual courtroom. Outside the courtroom, they never saw a camera person.
Okay.
End of.
All right. Okay. But I suppose they still knew it was going out. But I take your point, Ed. You did everything you did everything you could to.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So, Chris, you've been accused by a former DPP of making a fundamentally good point. Do you want to make one more fundamentally good point?
This is really to support the programme. There's 2 points I hope I can make that are fundamentally good. One is, I think anything that draws public attention to the criminal justice system and to jury trials is good, because I think there's a huge amount of misinformation out there, particularly in the media, about what really goes on in trials. And I'm a big advocate of cameras in court. I think that trials should be broadcast, not what the jury talk about, but what the evidence is, with certain restrictions. Absolutely. I think anyone should be entitled to watch on a live stream a trial in the way that you could if you have the time and inclination to go to a court and sit in the public gallery. So I'm all for opening things up, and I think this is a great example of that. And I applaud Channel 4 and the producers for actually bringing this issue into the public domain. But the one thing I think that's missing from this is that our jury system is on the verge of collapse, not because of juries, but because of the lack of funding in the Crown Court system. There are delays, of years and years and years for cases to get to trial. Rape cases, for example, are now on average taking 5 years from the date of the incident, which is alleged to have been a rape, to a trial. 5 years for a victim to wait to get to court. And just think of the impact on that, of the reliability of verdicts, as opposed to, as it were, focusing attention on the potential difficulties with the jury system. I think it would be good for he would understand that murder cases like this are very, very rare and very unusual. The day-to-day business of the Crown Court is very different, and the state of the system is very different to the one that's being portrayed in this programme.
Okay, thanks very much to all of you. That was Daw KC. We also heard from Sir Max Hill, until last year, DPP for England and Wales, Dr. Lee Curley for the Open University, and thanks and congratulations on a great programme to Ed Kelly, exec producer on the jury murder trial, which you can see on Channel 4.